I'm particularly happy to speak here today after Paul and Elle, particularly since it's somewhat coordinated presentation. I'm gonna report of some studies that were commissioned for the European Standardization Committee. And I want to make clear from the beginning that the goal here of the whole presentation is to have the standard being able to be adopted wider in building codes and regulations. So it's not a critique to the standard per se, but it's just a discussion how to make it more suitable for building codes and so on, so that we can actually bring up our, let's say, daylight cases. And the title is Rethink Requirements for Daylight Provision. So I would say that the first question that arises is are they wrong? Why should we rethink them? And of course, in my opinion, the answer is no. The requirements as they are for daylight provision, they're adequate if the scope of the standard is as it is to provide or describe adequate daylighting. So the daylight provision there is research informed. The levels, in my opinion, again, they are pretty much what we describe and as adequate daylighting, no problem there. But another scope of the daylight standard is to promote the adoption of daylighting among building designers. So if on one end the standard says what should be done, it does it very well. In my opinion, it does not address very well what happens in building practice. So it does not acknowledge at the moment very well what has been done in the past and what is being done even today because of political pressures. We have seen sometimes misalignment with energy regulations and so on, and so on. One of the, I would say, the biggest strength of the standard, something that I really like, is that we have one standard for many building programs. So it doesn't matter which type of destination as you're building, you can apply the same standard. But there is also a little bit of weakness there, I would say, because when we look at daylight provision criteria, they are largely informed by research that has been conducted in non-residential spaces and offices, and it works pretty well there. However, when we move to residential spaces, maybe things might be a little bit different. Maybe we can have a little bit more flexibility with the standard. I don't know, but it's worth at least asking ourselves the question. So what we did with Paul, Helen, and a bunch of other people that I'm going to mention, we tried to look at the standard compliance or the compliance of residential rooms in different countries in Europe with the current version of the standard. I have some examples here. The first one comes from Greece. Here I had two master students, Eleni and Nit, that helped me, and they have been modeling 6 residential buildings in Thessaloniki, which is a very dense urban environment, for roughly 235 rooms, residential rooms, regularly occupied rooms. The buildings that they were testing, they were in different urban density there in Thessaloniki. They looked quite similar, I would say. Those blocks from the 80s, they have been built between the 80s and 5 years ago, I think was the newest one. They have balconies, they have awnings, although we did not simulate awnings to make things more comparable. So we excluded shading from our simulations, even for the other cases. Straight to the results, it's worth saying that similarly to what Claudia has been mentioning, Helen, Paul, in Greece, like in most of European countries, daylight is regulated by a simple geometrical approach, window to floor area ratio. What happens if we apply the European standard instead? Well, only 22% of the rooms we had, they comply with the minimum requirements for daylight factor. When it comes to the luminance-based path, the compliance is a little bit higher and largely depend on the urban density. So we found compliance rate between 10 and 60, 70%, I would say. None of the rooms we had could comply with the medium level of recommendation from the daylight standard, which was quite disappointing, I would say. Then we moved to Turkey. Same approach, 5 buildings. This time they are located in Izmir, and we have roughly 100 regularly occupied residential rooms. Here I got help from Ecenur Kuru, a doctoral student from Yazar University, which I would like to thank you for the work there. She did very detailed model with surrounding of those buildings, real existing building again, Run the simulation. Again, in Turkey, even in Turkey, window to floor area ratio is the requirement for the code. And by the way, she informed me that this has been dropped also, which is quite worrying. But I want that you keep in mind what is happening outside our world here. Running the simulation, 0% compliance with either daylight factor or illuminance-based method for a combination of urban density and shape of the room. Windows, they were pretty much okay, I would say. Then we moved to, by far, the biggest project or the biggest analysis that we did. It's for Sweden. In this case, we had 30 buildings, more than 3,500 daylit rooms spread across Sweden, different building forms, different urban densities. They represent very well the whole Swedish building stock, and we know that because we did some proper survey. And the building itself, actually, they are taken from a larger sample of 110 buildings that was produced some years ago by some colleagues that I saw in the room but now disappeared, Jason Burnas, and we took a selection of that, ran simulation together with Helle Paul, Angel Perez Morata from ACC Glass, and two very excellent master students that we had, Shin Tong and Bernard from Lund University. Same approach, best practice, daylight modeling, a lot of detailing there, surrounding, and we compared the compliance rate with the European standard and with the national building code. National building code in Sweden, it was quite advanced, let me say it was, speaking at the past, was requiring a daylight factor of 1% point or median, requirement that is going to be dropped for a more qualitative approach. So, you know, things are changing and not for the good. So the whole thing here for us was, okay, we have to just put ourselves there again and, you know, prompt and push for daylight. Results, now you know the story, how it goes. 16% compliance rate with minimum requirements, daylight factor path. 33% compliance with a luminance-based path. That's already quite interesting. We knew already, but there is a little bit of misalignment between the two paths. Other interesting result, we did run also compliance rate with LEED. You know that LEED is a voluntary certification scheme that aims to excellence. And the compliance rate with LEED is exactly the same as the minimum level of the European standard illuminance-based method. So this tells us that, you know, it's quite ambitious, the standard in that sense. 66% compliance with the National Building Code daylight factor. And of course, it's not 100% because some of the buildings were built before the building code was in place. So, what's the message here? Well, we think, I'm speaking at plural here, we think that the European standard describes adequate daylight provision very well. We know what good daylighting is. However, we should acknowledge that at the moment, for much of what has been built, the criteria are a little bit too ambitious in a way. So a proposal that could be done is to formulate a little bit alternative targets that are more aligned with practice, what is out there, and probably decouple those from the definition of quality or quality benchmarks. So saying basically, okay, the targets or lower targets that we are proposing, they do not give good daylighting, but we acknowledge that some buildings do exist and they should be mentioned. What's the reason there? The reason is that if we say that some buildings, we acknowledge that some buildings exist, it's perhaps easier for the standard to be adopted in building codes, rather than saying, okay, anything that is below this quality benchmark, it does not exist, is not worth staying there. And, you know, we would like to have the standard being used for any kind of building and context, like historical city centers, very dense, new development, and so on. So again, I think the key here is to decouple. So not saying that quality should be lower. Quality is what is written today, but perhaps we should say that we know that something else exists and something might happen out there, so that we have to find other targets. How do we do that? I have an example here, which is based on the Swedish building stock. It's just an example, so it's not something that I think should be adopted or anything, but I would just to communicate the way in which we have been thinking in the smaller group with Ella and Paul in this case. We took the residential building stock and we said, look, okay, we have 3 compliance rate. One that is 16% is the daylight factor. This is quite demanding. Perhaps we can call it the high level of recommendation. 33%, the compliance rate was the same as LEED with the luminance-based method. So if it is like LEED, we can say, well, that's pretty good daylighting, so we call it the medium level. And what we have, the status quo, the current compliance rate can be called the minimum level, so the status quo. And then we thought to the residential stock only. Again, this is only an example. Just take it for what it is. And we said, okay, if you are in a residential case, perhaps uniformity of illuminance inside the space is a little bit less important than in office spaces, right? This was more like a logical deduction rather than research informed. Then we said probably we can avoid using the current approach in the standard, which has a target minimum requirements, which is basically another way to define uniformity, and rather give just a single target based either on illuminance or on targeted area fraction. We did a lot of simulation combination step by step there, and basically what we did was to find the combination of combinations of illuminance and targeted area fraction that would reach the compliance rate that we had before. And there were different combinations and tried to see how those combinations would result in potential room design. And now it's perhaps can be overwhelming in a short presentation, but we ended up with 4 different potential proposals to discuss together that were providing exactly the same compliance rate that we were looking for. And depending on the proposal, based on targeted illuminance or targeted area fraction, an hypothetical shoebox room would result in maybe higher depth or a little bit more shallow. It depends a little bit. So the discussion there was like more a kind of not thinking about daylight per se, but how would that be perceived in practice? Of course, if we go for this solution, the third one, which allows deeper rooms, of course, building developers would be happier, but that would result in very low uniformity. So what does it mean in terms of daylight quality and so on? Again, as someone said in previous presentation, I don't have the answer, but was the way in which we started to discuss things, and which I think was quite important to at least start again a discussion and make the daylight standard, I said it, make it possible. So make the daylight standard have the possibility to be digested, if I can use the term, by practitioner, by legislator, and finally enter slowly the building code so that daylight and daylight design can slowly enter into the routine of building design. And during the presentation, I always said we rather than I, and the reason is that I've been coordinating the work there, but of course there is a bunch of people that have been helping her, so a lot of people that I want to acknowledge, some are named, some not. Yeah, and that's all. Thank you.